Hey guys, how's it going? It's Danconia and welcome back to the Overwatch League Roundup 2020 Week 5 results. So we have had yet another homestand in Washington DC, the second of this year, and it's been an absolutely incredible week of Overwatch because there have been some really interesting results here. Obviously, it has been the first week of hero pools, where we ban a certain amount of heroes, 2 DPS, 1 tank, 1 support, and we see what happens. The meta goes crazy, and we honestly didn't really know too much of what to see coming into this. We thought it would either be bunker or it would be dive. We have seen a lot more dive, in my opinion, than bunker, but they've both had their spotlights and they've both had their ups and downs across the week. This week, the heroes that were banned were Reinhardt, Widowmaker, McCree, and Moira, so Deathbally comps were out of the window, but also hitscan were kind of out of the window as well, and this was the week where we were going to ask questions of the likes of Carpe and XZ of the Paris Eternal, where they've popped off on the McCree, they've popped off on the Widowmaker, but can they pop off on heroes that we haven't seen them on yet, or haven't seen them on in a long time? So this week was a very intriguing week. Let's get to the results then, and Toronto Defiant kicked us off against the Florida Mayhem. Toronto Defiant had an atrocious week 4, losing heavily to the Atlanta Reign and also giving the Houston Outlaws their first victory of the season. So Toronto Defiant wanted to bounce back against a Florida Mayhem side who have, kind of been up and down. We came into this season having high hopes that the Florida Mayhem were going to be a lot better than they were last season. I think they are, but they're not quite where I wanted them to be. I wanted them to be a play-in team, and we're not sure whether they're quite there yet. So this was an interesting matchup. Toronto Defiant, though, this week really did work in their favour because Toronto Defiant had been running the dive before, and they wanted to gravitate more to the Doomfist or the Sombra and the Winston instead of the Reinhardt. So this week really favoured them, but the scoreline definitely doesn't. So 3-1 to the Florida Mayhem, and this is a disappointing look for the Toronto Defiant. Florida Mayhem, they were on top in this match pretty, I say convincingly, but there was a fight from Toronto Defiant, but it was clear that Florida Mayhem were the better team on the day, and it's a disappointing thing for the Toronto Defiant to be seeing, because Toronto Defiant, this should have been their week, really, in terms of the hero bans, the hero pools. It should have been their week, considering dive was going to be perhaps pretty dominant, and we didn't see that. Toronto Defiant are slipping down big time in terms of power rankings and seeding right now, and next week it only possibly gets worse because Winston is banned. And Sombra is also banned. So, dive heroes, we're probably not going to see dive at all next week. So, Toronto, it's looking rough. It's looking rough for this Canadian team, and I'm struggling to see where they turn it around right now. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're certainly now starting to put Toronto Defiant nearer the bottom with perhaps Boston, rather than putting them as, perhaps, as I said at the start of the season, perhaps gatekeepers to the play-ins or something like that. So it's been a disappointing week for the Toronto Defiant, but it's been a bounce that Florida Mayhem dearly needed after their week 4, where they lost heavily to the New York Excelsior and lost very narrowly to the London Spitfire. They really wanted to bounce back here, and they got the win that they needed. And this is the sort of games that Florida need to put to bed, and they did that with ease. Moving on then, and we saw the Paris Eternal taking on the Houston Outlaws. So, Houston Outlaws got their first win last week at their own homestand, and it was all great and everything, but the Houston Outlaws, even though they lost in their first game as well of last week, they looked improved, and they looked like they could fight, which is something we hadn't seen from them in the previous weeks. We thought they were going to get rolled, and they didn't, which is a great look for the Houston Outlaws, but could they carry this over to a game against a very powerful Paris Eternal team that really put the Atlanta Reign on their backsides last week, which was to everyone's surprise. But the thing is, in Houston's favour here is the fact that the Paris Eternal had to take on the Philadelphia Fusion on the Sunday. So the Paris Eternal possibly were going to put a lot more of their concentration into that match against the Fusion, and perhaps take this Houston Outlaws game for granted. And I think they did, looking at what happened. Paris Eternal, they were outclassed by the Houston Outlaws, and I can't believe I'm saying that. But The Houston Outlaws, again, this favoured them this week, just like it should have favoured Toronto. When we saw Houston go to the dive last week, it worked for them, and it worked for them very well. We saw Blase move over to those more projectile heroes, and it favoured him instead of playing that McCree. Obviously, with McCree banned, we didn't see any Linkser. That's no surprise. We mainly saw Dante and Blase, and it worked. And Houston Outlaws got a 3-0 victory over Paris Eternal, which is a very bad loss for the Paris Eternal, regardless of the result against the Fusion, which we will talk about in a minute. Because I said this on Discord, and I will say it in a minute. It's just consistency. And consistency always worries me for teams like Paris Eternal, because it can make the difference between automatic play-ins, playoffs, or play-ins. This sort of consistency. And this week, it's been a very bizarre week for Paris Eternal, but we'll move on to him in a minute. The last game of the Sunday was Boston Uprising taking on the Washington Justice. So this was a teller for me, because Boston Uprising, they hadn't played all that much this season, and it was a teller whether Boston Uprising could come to Washington and somehow come away with something. Somehow bounce back from a poor start. The only one they've got on the board is the Houston Outlaws win, and that was a match, let's say that. But Washington Justice, this is a win that they are expected to get, and they get that win, 3-1. Boston Uprising, though, they were in this game, and what is really disappointing from an Uprising point of view, especially on Rialto, which I believe was the last map, I can't remember now, but Rialto, the ult usage from Boston Uprising was atrocious. So we saw some Sombra Bay, and both of Boston's supports die, and then they invest Blizzard and EMP. And that is just bizarre. At this level of Overwatch, why are they doing that? That is atrocious. From a coaching point of view, from a player point of view, I wouldn't expect that on ladder at certain levels. So to see this coming out from a team at the highest level of Overwatch esports is very disappointing and very worrying. And Boston Uprising, this has got to be sorted out, because otherwise you are going to be propping up this league. With the bounce back that Houston Outlaws have had over their past few matches, Boston, it's looking like 20th right now. Quite majorly 20th, with perhaps Toronto in 19th. That's what it's looking like right now. Of course, we haven't seen the other teams yet in the Pacific much, so, take that with a grain of salt, but that's what it's looking like right now. So Boston, changes need to be made. They really do need to be made. But Washington Justice, this is their first homestand win, so congratulations to them, because if you remember in their first homestand, they lost to the Paris Eternal, and they lost ever so narrowly via a reverse sweep, which we've only seen one of this season from the London Spitfire. So Washington Justice, this is really good to see that they get their win in front of their home fans, and I'm sure everyone really did love it in DC. But obviously, it's good they got that win, because their second match of the week is much, much harder. But moving on to the Sunday then, and this is the match that I'm going to talk about. Paris Eternal versus the Philadelphia Fusion. So, we came into this week regarding Paris as one of the best teams in the league because of the way they destroyed the Atlanta Reign. And then they lose 3-0 to the Houston Outlaws, and suddenly we're all questioning why we rated Paris so highly after those matches. But this game was entirely different. So Paris Eternal, this was a return to the Paris Eternal giving the big teams a game, and this match is by far the best match of the weekend. If you're going to go and watch a game from this weekend's matches, then watch this, because this was bonkers, and it was actually Overwatch at its very best in some respects. So Paris go 2-0 up at half-time, and we're worried about the Fusion, and we're looking at it, and Paris have come out, and they've come out with this massive game plan, and it's all working well for the Paris Eternal. We've seen Soon for the first time this week, and he's looking good. So they run Soon in XZ, and it's really working well for the Paris Eternal. But it's kind of, this was a demonstration of the power of coaching in the Overwatch League. Now often, coaching is memed in the Overwatch League, right? Well, coaches can't do much, it's all about in-game stuff, blah blah blah. This match proves that wrong, in my opinion. Because 2-0 down at halftime, Philadelphia Fusion have got to change something. So they come out, they rally, we're back to 2-2 again all of a sudden. Now, if you don't know the rules, then the coaches can intervene and talk to their players every 2 maps. They can have a coaching talk or coaching break. So at that, just before that map 5, there is another coaching talk, right? Not a massive one, not compared to halftime, but it's a coaching talk nonetheless. And all of a sudden, the game flips again, and Paris Eternal are on top, and they get the first point of the last map, which was Oasis, and then Philadelphia Fusion, they flip it again, and then they get the second map of Oasis, and then on the last map of Oasis, you get this absolute barnstormer, where it's almost too close to call. We had a massive round of overtime on this last map of Oasis, but it's in the end Paris Eternal clutching it out to get the win over Philadelphia Fusion 3-2. And this is it's great from the Paris Eternal to get this win against the Fusion, right? This ends Fusion's run of unbeaten games, it's their first loss of the season, blah blah blah. Paris Eternal looked very good. But it's also worrying from a Paris Eternal point of view, and so I'm going to go back to this point I made about consistency. I said on the Discord yesterday about this, or Sunday I should say, that Paris Eternal, it's all very well getting these wins against Philadelphia Fusion. Great win, not going to take that away from them. But it can't be at the expense of not beating teams that you should be beating, like the Houston Outlaws. It was possible that Paris were going to have a really good week this week if they had beaten the Outlaws and beaten the Fusion. But instead, we're left with a lot of questions. Paris Eternal did really well to beat Fusion, but did they play really badly against the Houston Outlaws, or did Houston Outlaws just play really good? What happens when Houston Outlaws take on Philadelphia Fusion? Is it all because of hero pools? Who knows? It's very difficult to tell, and it's disappointing from a Paris point of view. If they'd won that Houston game, we'd be talking about Paris as, are they the best team in the league? That's what we'd be saying right now. But I don't feel confident enough to say that because they lost to the Outlaws. The two games the Paris have lost this season have been against Toronto and Houston. Arguably some of the worst teams in the league, although Houston are bouncing back now. So it's inconsistency that worries me with the Paris Eternal. If they can iron that out, Paris Eternal are looking like a major playoff contender. However, for the Fusion, let's not just concentrate on Paris Eternal. For the Fusion, it's not a major upset. Paris, at the start of the week, backed them to give Philadelphia Fusion a very close game. And that they did. It's just Paris were coming out on top on the day. And that's unfortunate for the Fusion, but I don't think it's a bad thing to keep them grounded going into a interesting bout of fixtures. And Fusion, they'll continue to do very well. And I'm sure this will just rile on the coaches and the Fusion more to not drop any more matches from here on in. But moving on then, and we've got two other games to take a look at. So the next up was the New York Excelsior taking on the Washington Justice. This was, Washington, they're at their own homestand, they want to put up a fight, but this is the New York Excelsior we're talking about. This is the only game of the week that we see from New York. But what we do see from New York is the Sabi Tracer. Oh, don't we love it? The meta heavily favours the New York Excelsior here. I think they go back to the 2018 look that we saw from the New York Excelsior when they were our number 1 seed in that 12-team season. They take this match 3-1. I think everyone would have expected that. Washington put up a good fight, don't get me wrong, but they can't cope with the New York Excelsior's quality here. It was really great to see that combination of Libero and Sabi popping off again with Sabi on the Tracer. It was really great to see that Manu back on his Winston. And it was really good to see Hotbar slotted in really well alongside this team in that look that they showed us 2 years ago. So I think this is a really good display from the New York Excelsior this week, and I expect them to push on further. But to round this off, we saw the Boston Uprising taking on the Atlanta Reign. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. If the Boston Uprising's performance against the Washington Justice was bad, well, this was worse. This was not close. Now, if you're looking for a game to fill a very short amount of time, this is the game you want to go to, because this was so quick. Yeah, Boston have got no way on earth to match the Atlanta Reign here. Atlanta Reign were just too good. The great thing we saw from the Atlanta Reign this week is that we get to see Edison for the first time, which was a really, really interesting show. Edison was great alongside Erster. Edison and Erster is going to be a duo to be reckoned with. They are very, very good. And he slotted right in. He honestly was perfect. He was perfect. Also, great display from Hawk. I did criticize Hawk a lot last week. He didn't have a great display for Atlanta when they lost heavily to Paris. But this week he really did bounce back. But something we have to remember is they were playing Boston. And at the moment, Boston are the worst team in the league. Without a doubt. They have taken that crown from Houston Outlaws. So congratulations, Boston. Yeah, you've taken the crown as the worst team in the league. Halo, it was okay. I guess it was an okay debut, but it was being thrown in at the deep end, so, you know, take what you can in it. But it's not looking brilliant for Boston. And it's just a case of, I think they need a coaching overhaul, and I think they've got some good players. They've got Jerry who can be good. We know Fusions can be good. Fusions was great at the World Cup back along for the UK squad. Myung Bong has great pedigree. Color Hex, he hasn't stepped up so far, but he can step up. So there are opportunities for this Boston Uprising squad, but I think the coaching is horrific. I'm not going to lie, I think the coaching is absolutely atrocious at the Boston Uprising, and it needs to change. And that's the brutal truth of it. But let's take a look at our standings then, and things have changed. With Fusion dropping that game against the Paris Eternal, they have lost their top spot. This is now owned by the Vancouver Titans. We have 2 unbeaten teams in the league right now that have played a game. This is the Vancouver Titans and the San Francisco Shock. They have only played a very minimal amount of Overwatch this season. Remember, we saw them in week 1, but we haven't seen them since because the Pacific East teams having their homestands cancelled. So we haven't seen them since, but we will see them very soon in week 8, and it should be very interesting when we see that. Now, arguably top of the league at the moment is New York Excelsior, if you want to count that. They are obviously on that 5-1 record joint with the Philadelphia Fusion, but they have that slightly better differential. So New York in 3rd, Philadelphia 4th, Paris are up to 5th. Again, they could have been joint with Philadelphia and New York if they got that win against Houston, so it's disappointing from a Paris point of view, but they are still right up there. Atlanta Reign are up into 6th after their wins, and London Spitfire dropped down to 7th, not featuring this week, obviously, after Atlanta win. Los Angeles Valiant, again, we haven't seen them in quite a while, they're in 8th. Florida Mayhem are in 9th, getting their win, so they're kind of, at the moment, looking like perhaps one of those gatekeeper teams with the play-ins. Washington Justice are in 10th, again, they got a win they needed this week, and, you know, a tough game against New York is nothing to be ashamed of. Houston Outlaws are up to 11th, with those 2 wins on the board now. It's great luck from Houston. Toronto are down to 12th, and Boston are down to 13th. Now, at the moment, look at 12th and 13th, and say 19th and 20th, because that's what we're looking at here. Obviously, joint 14th, we have Chengdu, Hangzhou, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Seoul. They all haven't played yet. They are most likely not going to be bottom of the league. Los Angeles Gladiators and Dallas Fuel prop us up at the moment in 19th and 20th, but remember, they haven't played, really. You know, Gladiators lost narrowly to the Vancouver Titans in the first week. Dallas Fuel, they had a tough first week. I would not expect them to be below Boston. I'm looking at 12th and 13th as being the bottom 2 teams in the league right now. So that's the way to look at it. It's going to be interesting, and there's some very interesting games coming up, especially next week, because next week is going to be very, very interesting. We're probably going to go back to the meta we saw pre-hero pools because of the picks. Oh my goodness me. But we will go through that in another video. But the matches just square up as really interesting matches, right? So we've got New York versus Atlanta next week, which is going to be really interesting. Paris versus Florida, you know, it's a game that Paris need to grind out if they want to be up there. London have got a really tough week after missing this week, so they've got to play Philadelphia and Atlanta. It's going to be a really tough week for London Spitfire. And Boston versus Florida. Boston, you need to win that. At Florida's very own homestand. We are going to Miami next week. So it's going to be really interesting. Toronto Defiant versus Washington Justice, another interesting run. Toronto, you really need to bounce back. So I think next week is going to be a very interesting week, because if Boston and Toronto go without wins, then we are definitely looking at those two being two worst teams in the league right now. But for now, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.